A Twist of Fate by AdrianaintheSnow, Chapter 5. Janice woke in a bed and immediately panicked. A million terrified thoughts about why and how he was in a bed rushed through his mind before he even had a chance to peek open his eyes. Yet then, through the darkness of his thoughts, he felt familiar little feet digging into his back. With a soft breath, he opened his eyes and craned his head around to find Remus smashed into the twin-sized bed with him. He gave his head a few seconds to catch back up with his situation. The bakery man, Patton. Remus had predicted Patton's death, and Janice had saved him. That action had changed fate so much that Janice and Remus had both gotten new soul marks. Janice wasn't even sure how many each of them had gotten. He hadn't bothered to check yet. However, he did know that one of the soul marks belonged to Patton. It was absolutely terrifying. Parental soulmate. If it had been any other type of soulmate, it would have been easier. The problem with a parental soulmate is that if Patton wanted to, he could basically legally keep them. They were both minors with no biological parents left. Very few people would argue the point, even if Janice and Remus went in kicking and screaming. Plus, being forced to stay in one place with adults who refused to listen would be a death sentence, and even if it wasn't, they'd still be trapped. The blue star on Janice's face was, for all intents and purposes, a mark of ownership. As someone who had lived in a cage for several years, it didn't exactly sit well with him. But no matter how dangerous Patton may end up being to them, Janice knew with the state of Remus's visions, they didn't have a chance on the outside. Remus had explained exactly what had happened after they went to sleep last night. Janice knew already that large changes in fate could potentially muddy a psychic's vision for a time, particularly when said vision personally affected the one having the visions. They didn't often have to deal with this fact, as Remus was currently one of the two most powerful psychics in the world, his birth having been prophesied as far as hundreds of years ago, bar some important details, and as such, small changes didn't mess with his powers as much as they did the other psychics. However, there had been two instances where his abilities had dampened to a noticeable degree. The first time had been when he'd helped Janice escape Halo Mark, though he'd still gotten enough feedback to keep them from getting recaptured. That instance had also corresponded to Remus and Janice getting new soul marks, though each of them had only gotten one at the time, the sibling ones for each other. The second one had been in a seemingly random time. He and Janice had been on the run together for about 6 months when his visions had suddenly dimmed considerably to both of their distress. Remus had no idea what had caused it, but had noticed a change in the landscape of the future when his visions returned the next day. He theorized that it must have been a good change, as he couldn't see many new events, just the absences of some. Remus could only see bad future and past events, so him not getting an influx of new things probably was a net positive for the world. His best guess was that whatever the change was, it must have caused the sudden and inexplicable erasure of the death of the superhero Magi-Man that had been fated to occur in over 2 decades. However, the circumstance was not quite like those 2 other times, because this time Remus could see nothing at all. Fate was apparently still in flux after Patton's life was saved. Until it settled, Remus would have no more idea what the future held than Janice. This was a problem considering that Janice and Remus, as 12- and 9-year-olds living on the street, and at least one of whom was still being doggedly tracked by Halo Mark, routinely almost died every day. Remus's visions were what guided them to food and shelter and away from murderers and people who had put them back in cages. Which meant Patton, with his willingness to provide food and shelter and not murder them on the spot for the time being, was a known risk, and better than the possible alternatives. They may very well still end up in cages or dead, but it was the only chance they had. So, Janice had let Patton take them back to his house and feed them dinner. He'd accepted the clean clothes and the shower. The only protest that had left his lips had been when Patton suggested they sleep in the closed-off basement, citing the fact that there was a queen-size bed down there, and if Janice and Remus refused to be in different rooms for the night, it would be more comfortable. Instead, they ended up sleeping in what Patton said had been his childhood bedroom, full of posters and pastel colors. Janice had not wanted to submit to sleep the night before, but his body had been exhausted, so he had ended up asleep after a few hours. At least nothing had happened during the night. He was still okay. Remus was with him, and he could see sunlight peeking through the curtains on the window. He was running on the hope that Patton would keep up the nice act at least long enough for Remus to get his visions back, though he was unsure what would happen if Janice and Remus tried to leave. Janice's thoughts were brought back to the present when Remus started doing his typical morning squirming. He'd be up in a few minutes. A hand flopped over Janice's chest, and he mumbled something before his feet climbed up Janice's back. Janice winced as they kicked the back of his neck lightly. The boy's upper half wiggled and then flopped part way over Janice as his feet continued to kick a pattern into the air. He let out a soft humming sound, and eventually his body poured completely over Janice, and he landed in a heap on the other side. He then continued to wiggle. Janice reached out to grab one of his flailing hands, and after a moment he calmed down a bit. His eyes flickered open. "Janice?" he asked. He reached out to pat Janice's cheeks a couple of times. "I'm awake." "I can see that." "Good morning." "Good morning, Remus." There were a couple more moments of sleepy calm, and then Remus woke up the rest of the way. He popped up onto his knees on the bed, jostling Janice a bit. His eyes widened when he noticed how bouncy his sleeping surface was, and he bounced a couple of times. "I smell food," he declared, still bouncing as he said it. "Do you think it's good food? It smells like bacon. Will Patton burn the house down? I can't see if he will or not. He cooked good spaghetti last night. Is that easy to cook? Is he a good cook? Will it taste good? Will it just be bacon? That would just be protein and fat. Does he know that? Did you know you can get malnourished if you don't eat enough carbs? Even if you're eating enough calories? You can die from it. Should we go down for breakfast or wait until he comes and get us? Will he be mad if we pick wrong? Will he never come up to see us if we don't go down, and then we'll starve to death? Where are my clothes? This shirt's too big, but it's really soft. It smells like lavender. Is this his detergent? Did you know eating one of the laundry pods can make you die? I wonder if he uses laundry pods or the liquid stuff. If I lick my shirt and there's detergent on it, will I die? He washed my usual clothes yesterday after I changed. Will they smell like lavender too? I should check." And with that, Remus bounced out of the bed to go grab his clothes. Janice followed him out of bed. Patton had washed the clothes they'd arrived in, and they were probably now cleaner than they'd been since they'd gotten them. Remus continued to chatter as they dressed, about nothing in particular. He seemed rather content in this new environment, even while Janice was in constant worry. Of course, he usually relied on his visions to tell him if something was bad, and May just instinctually be assuming if he wasn't seeing anything, everything was fine. So Janice wasn't sure if he should completely trust the boy's perspective. Once they were both dressed, they headed downstairs, hand in hand. "Hi, boys," Patton said when they arrived at the bottom of the steps. He was in the kitchen, but had angled himself so he had a view of the stairs. Janice wasn't sure if that was to make sure they didn't make a break for it, or just him being eager to greet them when they woke. "Want something to eat?" He seemed to already understand the power of food, and Janice wondered if that would be used against them soon. "Yeah!" Remus said with no hesitation, perking up. For someone who only ever saw the worst of humanity, he had been strangely trusting when it came to Patton. His eagerness made Janice bristle a bit. "Why don't you come and wash your hands and sit? I'm almost done." "Do I gotta?" Remus whined. "Wash your hands?" Patton asked. "Yeah, I took a shower just last night. I'm clean!" Janice almost rolled his eyes at that assumption, but was too preoccupied with watching Patton's expression. Patton was frowning slightly, and Janice found himself waiting for his reaction with bated breath. Clearly he wanted to say yes. Remus had to wash his hands. But if they pushed him, would he deny Remus food over it? Patton dithered. "I would prefer that you did so," he said slowly after a moment, "as it is a good habit to have. Not washing your hands before you eat can make you sick, since you might be getting germs into your mouth. That being said, I can't make you do anything." "Yay!" Remus cheered. "Go wash your hands, Jimmy," Janice instructed firmly before he ran away with that idea. "Aw," he pouted, but listened. He wandered off to do as Janice asked, and Janice and Patton briefly met eyes before Janice turned to follow him. Remus had tucked his tongue between his teeth as he stood on his tiptoes to turn the water on. He wouldn't be able to reach the soap where it was, so Janice reached forward and handed it to him. Janice's reward for his good deed was a face full of bubbles once Remus got it into a lather. Janice sighed. Once Remus's hands were clean, instead of going to the table, he padded off to stand next to Patton as the man finished cooking the eggs. They immediately struck up a conversation about bugs Remus had seen in the last month. Meanwhile, Janice quickly rinsed his face of bubbles before washing and drying his hands himself. "And then it flew away," Remus was saying when Janice turned back. "Aw," Patton said. "That's sad, but I bet he had some stuff to do." "It got eaten by a bird 2 days later." "Oh," Patton said, but shook off his surprise a moment later. "I think my mom had some books about local bugs in the office. Maybe we can figure out what type he was." "Really?" Remus said, bouncing up on the balls of his feet. Sure, Patton agreed. Oh, do you have any books on octopuses? He asked. I love octopuses. I'm not sure, Patton replied, but we can look, or I can get you one from the library. Oh, and Japanese beetles are also pretty cool. Anyway, can we get a book about snakes for Evan? Of course, Patton said kindly as Janice resisted slamming his head against the counter. Would one of you mind getting the grape juice out of the refrigerator, please? Okay, Remus agreed, skipping over to the fridge. Patton watched him go with a slight smile on his face that made Janice want to squirm with something. He couldn't tell if it was a bad something or not, but it was definitely a something. Patton turned a bit to glance at Janice and quirked his lips up a bit more when he saw him watching. He returned his attention to the stove after a moment and poured the eggs into a prepared bowl. Then he brought that along with a plate of bacon and toast to the table. He'd already cut up an orange for each of them and set it at every plate. He knows about scurvy, Remus said, nodding in approval upon seeing it. Patton let out a surprised laugh. I do, he said. Do you like oranges? Fruits are yucky, but it's better than your body slowly breaking down and swallowing a bunch of blood because your gums won't stop breathing, Remus said, grabbing a piece of orange and stuffing it in his mouth. I guess that's right, Patton said. Maybe we can find a source of vitamin C that tastes better to you. I don't like broccoli, he proclaimed. I'll make a note of that, Patton replied, amused. Would you like me to get you some eggs? Uh-huh. Patton scooped out some eggs for him and hesitated with Janice before Janice held out his hand to take the bowl from him. He then offered a plate of bacon and toast around the table. How did you two sleep? Patton asked. Really good, Remus answered. I like beds. Patton grimaced a bit, but Remus didn't notice, too busy happily making himself an egg and bacon sandwich. And you, Evan? Fine, Janice replied, taking a bite of eggs. He blinked down at the eggs. Janice had made eggs on occasion while on the run, but there was something different about the eggs Patton made. They were a lot fluffier, and they tasted a lot better. In fact, the bacon and even the toast tasted better, though that may have just been that it was fresh bread instead of the day-old stuff they usually got. Plus, there was a lot of food. In fact, he was pretty sure Patton had no idea how much 3 people could eat in one go, because it seemed like he'd made enough for 6. Janice stopped eating when he was full, and it was an odd experience to have 2 consecutive full meals. He felt a bit tired, even though he'd only just woken up. He felt himself mentally drift a bit as Remus and Patton continued eating. They were much slower since Remus kept rambling, and Patton kept trying to politely pay attention to what he was talking about. This was nice, he supposed. It was almost scary how easily he could feel himself settle around Patton. He couldn't get attached or used to this. They'd have to leave eventually, he reminded himself harshly. His attention was brought back to the conversation when Remus just about flipped his plate off the table with the way he threw his arms around. Chocolate! He exclaimed. Janice looked over to see if that display of recklessness would make Patton mad, but it seemed to be the opposite. He seemed to enjoy Remus's enthusiasm. Chocolate chip or chocolate cookies? He asked. Both! Remus demanded. Double chocolate cookies, then, Patton said. Yay! Patton turned to Janice. Would you like to help us make them? Janice nodded. Sure, he agreed, surmising they were talking about baking cookies. Great, Patton said. Can you help me clear the table? If it means faster the cookies, yes, Remus said, getting up and grabbing his plate and glass. Janice grabbed his own plate with less enthusiasm and took it over toward the sink. Patton washed the dishes while he directed them around the room to gather different supplies for the cookie making. Patton had just put the last dish on the drying rack and was drying his hands when the doorbell rang. Janice immediately panicked because Patton could 100% have called the cops on them before they'd woken up. Patton seemed to sense his panic. It's just Remy, Patton said. Who you don't know. He's a friend, a soul friend. I totally forgot he was coming over today after his exam. I'll ask him to leave. He darted towards his front door. Janice leaned over towards Remus. Be ready to run, just in case. Remus nodded solemnly, even if he looked a bit sad, probably because he wouldn't be able to make cookies if they had to bolt. Then Janice followed after Patton on silent feet.